Jupiter is sometimes called the king of the planets. It's the largest planet in our solar system. Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune are giants too. They're all much bigger than the Earth, as you can see. But Jupiter is by far the biggest. Jupiter has beautiful, intricate clouds swirling over its entire surface. It also has a famous feature called the Great Red Spot. The red spot is a huge storm system swirling on Jupiter. This has existed for about as long as we've had telescopes to look at it. So it's hundreds of years old at least. It might even have been there since Jupiter was created, for all we know. As you can see, this one storm is bigger than the entire Earth. Jupiter also has huge electrical storms on its surface. Jupiter is a violent place. Just like all the other planets, Jupiter confounds evolutionary models of our solar system. For one thing, evolution says Jupiter can't be spinning as fast as it is. The evolutionary model makes certain predictions about how fast the planets will spin. However, Jupiter exceeds those predictions. One recent article quoted an evolutionist who has studied this problem. He said, "We came to the conclusion that if you accrete planets from a uniform disk of planetesimals, prograde rotation just can't be explained. The simulated bombardment leaves a growing planet spinning once a week at most, not once a day." This is a huge problem for evolution. Jupiter is not only the biggest planet in the solar system, it's also spinning the fastest. It spins all the way around on its axis in only 10 hours. How much energy do you need to spin up a planet this big to make it go this fast? The energy is enormous, and evolutionary models can't supply it. Scientists have also been studying the chemical composition of Jupiter. We've had several space probes fly close by it lately, and the results have surprised evolutionists. Evolutionary models predicted that Jupiter would lack certain elements: argon, krypton, xenon, nitrogen, and others. But it turns out that Jupiter has lots of these elements. The results of this study were published in the scientific journal Nature. An overview of that article said, "Jupiter is the largest of all the planets, but results in Nature now reveal the embarrassing fact that we know next to nothing about how or where it formed." Also, the evolutionary model requires Jupiter to have a large core inside of it. This would have been necessary for Jupiter to form from the solar nebula billions of years ago. Unfortunately for evolution, a recent space probe measured the mass of Jupiter's core. The evolutionary model needs Jupiter to have a large core, at least 10 times the mass of our Earth. But we now know that at most, the core can only be 3 times the mass of Earth. It might even be smaller than this. In fact, the probe couldn't even confirm that Jupiter has a core at all. Jupiter does not match evolution's predictions. And even then, we're still not finished listing evolution's problems with Jupiter. Scientists have studied how a planet like Jupiter would have formed from a disk of gas and dust, and the results have been devastating for the evolutionary model. Jupiter would have needed at least 10 million years to form, and that's being generous. Some scientists say it would take even longer than that. But these scientists also acknowledge that a disk of gas and dust wouldn't have lasted around our sun for that long. Many scientists believe that such a disk would have dissipated in less than 5 million years. This means that in the evolutionary model, Jupiter would have had no time to form. So, according to evolution, Jupiter shouldn't exist at all. The more we've studied Jupiter, the more evolutionists have realized it doesn't fit into their models. One recent report said this: "Talk about a major embarrassment for planetary scientists. There, blazing away in the late evening sky, are Jupiter and Saturn, the gas giants that account for 93% of the solar system's planetary mass, and no one has a satisfying explanation of how they were made." Well, that last part isn't true. The Bible has a very satisfying explanation of how they were made. But now that evolutionists have rejected the Bible, their only explanation for these planets is lots of shoulder shrugging. Jupiter has over 60 moons. They pose problems for evolution too. Let's take a look at the 4 biggest ones. From upper left clockwise, we have Io, Europa, Callisto, and Ganymede. Ganymede is the largest of Jupiter's moons. It's even bigger than the planet Mercury. Ganymede has one of the most bizarre surfaces in our entire solar system. It's crisscrossed with ridges and grooved terrain, but with weird patterns streaking across it all. Some places are rough and rocky, other places are flat and smooth. It almost looks like somebody took a giant paintbrush and painted huge swipes across the surface. But this isn't the only challenge Ganymede poses for people who try to explain how it formed without a creator. Evolutionary models predicted that Ganymede couldn't have a magnetic field. But when our space probes arrived and started taking measurements, we found that it does have a magnetic field. Ganymede doesn't match the evolutionary model at all. Then there's Callisto. This moon is the most heavily cratered object in the solar system. Evolutionists believe that it has one of the oldest surfaces of any object, about 4 billion years old. It was a real surprise then when our space probes took some close-up pictures. Evolutionists expected a large number of smaller craters to go with the big ones. But they aren't there. They should be there if the surface is really billions of years old, but they're not. Callisto doesn't match the evolutionary cratering model. Not only that, some of the pictures show what appears to be fresh ice on Callisto's surface. This means that there's still erosion and geological activity going on. Evolutionary models say that Callisto is old, cold, and dead, but apparently that's not true. Next, there's Europa. Europa is in some ways the opposite of Callisto. Callisto is the most heavily cratered object in the solar system. Europa is the smoothest. Not only are there very few craters, Europa has very little terrain of any kind. It's almost perfectly smooth. The entire moon is covered with a shell of ice. The ice is several miles thick, but some scientists believe there might be liquid water beneath it. And where there's water, there has to be life, right? We already talked about how ridiculous that idea is, but nevertheless, you still hear it in the news a lot. Somebody finds a new crack on Europa and thinks, ooh, look, water might ooze up into the crack and there might be life evolving in the water. Then some reporter runs a story about it that says we're on the verge of finding life elsewhere in the solar system, even though all we found was a crack in a moon. That sounds ridiculous, but it happens a lot in astronomy, unfortunately. Because Europa has only a few craters, we've been able to study them closely. One recent study has shown that the evolutionary model for cratering is all wrong. We've talked about cratering before. We've seen that evolutionists like to use craters to date things in the solar system. After all, the more craters something has, the longer it's been sitting there getting struck by other objects. Well, this study discovered that the impact of just one object can throw up debris and form lots and lots of craters. Scientists had already known this was possible, but evolutionists didn't expect the effect to be this large. The study showed that up to 95% of small craters and a lot of the medium ones were formed in this way. This means that these planets and moons have been struck with a lot fewer impacts than evolutionists thought. And that calls into question all those billions of years that these objects have supposedly been around. Remember that Venus's surface looks very young, but its crater supposedly proved is 500 million years old? Now we know this isn't true. And craters are also used to support an old age for the Earth's moon. Supposedly, our moon needed billions of years to accumulate all of its craters. Thanks to Europa, we now know this isn't true. The scientists in this study specifically said the Europa results caused problems for the current accepted age of Earth's moon. Isn't it interesting that one small moon of Jupiter, so far away from us, can wreck evolutionary models of even our own moon? The last moon of Jupiter that we'll be discussing is Io. Compared to Jupiter, Io is an insignificant little speck of a moon. But it's turned out to be one of the most spectacular places in the solar system. Io's surface is covered with volcanoes. All the spots you see on its surface here are volcanic. Over 400 volcanoes have been counted on Io, and at least 150 of them are active today. The black spot you see here is a volcano named Loki. It's more powerful than all the Earth's volcanoes combined. Volcanoes in Io can be incredibly violent. We've seen fountains of lava blasting material 180 miles into space. We've also measured geysers of lava shooting out of the volcanoes at over 2,000 miles per hour. That's more than 10 times as fast as the most violent volcanoes here on Earth. Io gives us some fascinating insights on the long-age evolutionary theories. For example, Io puts out twice as much heat as the Earth does. Where does all this heat come from? Well, some of it comes from tidal flexing. Io is caught in a gravitational tug-of-war between Jupiter on the one side and Jupiter's other large moons on the other. They're both pulling on Io, and this squeezing and flexing is generating heat inside Io's interior. The problem is that this squeezing can only account for some of Io's heat. So where does the rest of the heat come from? Well, If Io is young, it could still be cooling off from its initial formation. But if it's really billions of years old, that energy would have dissipated long ago. So, according to evolutionary theory, Io shouldn't have all those active volcanoes you see on its surface, but it does. Io's volcanoes create another problem for the models with billions of years. We've measured the lavas coming from the volcanoes, and there's an amazing amount of it. The Amirani volcano alone, which you see here, is flooding the moon's surface with 100 cubic meters of lava per second. It's erupting like that continuously, and this isn't even the biggest volcano on Io. For example, look at these before and after pictures of the Palan Patera. Between the times these photos were taken, there was a massive eruption that produced the dark spot you see on the upper right. That's a huge lava flow, about as big as the state of Nevada. And these flows happen quickly. We saw a different volcano produce almost this much lava in just 2 days. Has Io really been erupting like this for 4.5 billion years? We've measured some of these flows coming out of these volcanoes, and it's a huge amount of material. If Io really was 4.5 billion years old, it would have recycled itself through its own volcanoes over 30 times. Surely Io can't be billions of years old. And there's another problem too. We've studied volcanoes on Earth, and the lavas here reach amazing temperatures, 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. At least these temperatures seemed amazing until we examined Io. Evolutionists were flabbergasted with the discovery that some of the lavas on Io are almost 1,000 degrees hotter than Earth lavas. They're also very dense. So here's the problem for evolution. If Io really was billions of years old, these temperatures and densities wouldn't be possible. After the first few million years, Io should have formed a low-density crust, after all the higher-density material sank down to the inside. But there are still high-density materials on the surface. Forget about billions of years. Io apparently isn't even millions of years old. Io looks quite young. It matches perfectly with the biblical account of creation just a few thousand years ago. And that brings us to the end of our discussion on Jupiter. So let's review. Here's what you're not being told about Jupiter and its moons. According to evolution, Jupiter can't be spinning as fast as it is. According to evolution, Jupiter can't be made up of the material it's made up of. According to evolution, there wasn't enough time for Jupiter to even form. Ganymede shouldn't have a magnetic field, but it does. Callisto shouldn't be geologically active, but it is. Europa shows that long-age crater counting methods are wrong, and Io looks very young. Evolutionary models fail utterly to explain Jupiter. That's why evolutionists make complaints like this one. Building Jupiter has long been a problem for theorists. Or this one. I don't think the existence of Jupiter would be predicted if it weren't observed. So why do they still cling to a broken model? Because when you reject the truth, you have to accept a lie. Pity the poor evolutionist who is so committed to a bankrupt theory that he can't see the hand of his creator in this majestic planet.